Welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Dimes.
And I'm Brian Rohlenbacher.
And we have a fun show for you today. Just listen in on what we've got.
That's right. In Culture Talk, Sandra's going to be speaking with astronomer Hugh Ross about whether atheism is the default for scientists.
And in Give and Take, Jeff Swearick will be talking with biochemist Fazale Rana about kind of a pretty wild question, and that is if a computer algorithm can explain life. That's pretty wild. What do you think? Are we in an algorithm, Brian?
No, I think this is way too unstable to be an algorithm.
That is like the best argument. Okay, we're done.
Well, first up, we have RTB 101. Krista's going to be speaking with philosopher and theologian Ken Samples on whether Adam and Eve were specially created.
Let's check it out.
Now it's time for RTB 101, where we discuss practical questions to equip you to share your faith more effectively. And here to help me talk about a very foundational question to our faith is theologian and philosopher Kenneth Samples. Welcome, Ken.
Hello, Krista.
You know, I've been collecting some letters recently from social media, and I have one that I thought maybe we could talk about today. This one is from Reverend Jim, and he asks, what is the biblical evidence that Adam and Eve were specially created? And if special, or were they maybe specially selected from an existing hominoid group? And what does it mean to be created in the image of God? So I thought maybe we could break Reverend Jim's question down into a few pieces. Maybe let's start with the biblical evidence that Adam and Eve were specially created. Are there any specific verses that you could point us to?
Yeah, I think a very important verse, Krista, in the context of how Adam was created, rests there in Genesis 2:7. It says that the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and the breath of life. And I would say a couple things about that. I would say, one, I think it's reasonable to conclude then that humans are a mind-body dualism, just basic idea there. But I also think that that passage gives support for special creation over any kind of evolutionary creation. And what I mean by that is, as you read the passage, it appears that the creation of Adam moves from the inanimate, non-life, dust of the ground, to the breath of life, and then to a living being. So exegetically, I think you can draw support from that passage that that is a special creation. I think from an evolutionary point of view, at least textually, we would expect it to go from animate, some kind of bipedal primate maybe, a possible ape, for example, ancestor of human beings, to animate. So I think that is a passage that I think exegetically supports an intervention of creation from inanimate to animate, and thus a special creation.
That's a really good picture there, because as God intervenes quite directly, seems to be the picture that we get there in Genesis chapter 2. And another thing I'm noticing here in the passage is that it says that God formed the man from the dust of the ground, which it says something similar to that later in chapter 2 about the animals. But what's different about the human is that he gives him the breath of life. So it's like, what that tells me is maybe there's similarities and differences between humans and animals.
Yeah, I agree. I think that since animals were also made from the dust of the ground, but they don't have the breath of life, they don't have the imago Dei, there's going to be both similarities and differences. There's going to be, anatomical, maybe physical characteristics that are similar, but we should also see some kind of profound sense of kind, or what we might call human exceptionalism.
That's really helpful. And I'm also thinking, you mentioned there the imago Dei, that means image of God in Latin. Right. And that's kind of how, from what I understand, the humans were created in chapter 1 of Genesis, that they're created in the image of God. Are there any scriptures that maybe give some specifics or give us insight into what that phraseology means?
Yeah, there is only a limited number of explicit passages. I think about a half a dozen that talk specifically about human beings made in the image and likeness of God, but they're critical passages. You referenced Genesis 1:26 through 28, made in the image of God, the likeness of God. I see image and likeness as being Hebrew parallelism, so they're the same thing. Male and female. And there are references in Genesis that talk about the value of human life, the dignity of human beings in the context of murder, for example. To attack a human life is to attack the Creator. And even James in the New Testament talks about using slurs against people is a violation of the Imago Dei. Now, what it means is a very important question. And I think, to be fair, Krista, not all Christians agree. There's kind of three basic views with some qualifications. I would call them, for example, and they are given different names: a resemblance view, a relational view, and a representative view. I see those as kind of the three definitions of the image of God.
So when we think about similarities and differences between humans and animals, are we qualitatively different than animals, or are we just on the spectrum of animals? We're at one end of that spectrum. How do we think about that?
Yeah, I think that this is a very important question. And in philosophy, we talk about differences of degree and differences of kind. I think if we were to adopt an evolutionary perspective, we would likely think that there will only be a difference in kind. I'm sorry, only a different in degree. I think that would be a Darwinian perspective. But I think from a biblical point of view, it's going to be a difference in kind. It is not just something more, but it is something that is distinct. And if we resemble God, for example, we're spiritual creatures, we're uniquely intellectual, volitional. I think if that is the case, then because of our spirituality, because of our capacity to engage in intellectual moral questions, I think that would clearly put us in a difference of kind, which would involve what many scientists call, again, human exceptionalism.
Very good. This has been a helpful discussion, and we want to thank our friend Reverend Jim, whoever he is, for writing into the show with this very thoughtful question. And thank you, Ken, for your very helpful answer. And I want to encourage all our viewers to go check out Ken's blog. It's called Reflections, and you can search for that at reasons.org.
Welcome to Culture Talk, where we talk about how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about the Christian faith. Joining me today is Hugh Ross, astronomer and author, and today we're going to be talking about something that you call default atheism. First, thank you for joining us, Hugh.
Oh, my pleasure.
So let's talk about default atheism. What does that mean?
Well, I use that as a term for someone who identifies himself as an atheist who really hasn't thought about the issues that are relevant to the philosophy of atheism. So it's default in the sense they just haven't thought about it.
Right. Well, and that makes sense. Like, you kind of tell this story about default atheism as you talk about an interaction that you had a few years ago at, was it a convention?
It was an Origin of Life research conference.
Conference. I'm too used to comic convention, so I use that word. But you bring up the topic of default atheism, and you say that some scientists feel like they might have this default view, and that any scientist really has the default view of atheism. And likewise, they might assume that the default view for Christians is young earth creationism. So how would you go about kind of addressing that misperception before you dive into the default atheism?
No, you're right. I mean, I ran into these scientists that says, well, I'm a scientist, therefore I must be an atheist. And then when they found out I was a Christian, they assumed, oh, you must believe that the universe is only a few thousand years old. And so that begins a door of opportunity to say, you know what, there's a range of different views from a Christian perspective, identifying myself as an old earth creationist who nonetheless takes the Bible seriously and inerrantly. And that raised a lot of questions from their perspective. And then I asked them questions. I mean, you say you're a scientist, therefore you're an atheist. Have you actually thought through these issues? Is there purpose in the universe? Just ask them a bunch of questions. I think what really shocked me was these people who called themselves atheists had never really thought about the issue of their coming death.
Yeah, you know, and that's a good kind of way to start conversations with people, is to really ask questions. People really like talking about themselves, but also it helps to, one, like define our terms. What do we mean by these worldviews? And is that your worldview? So when it comes to interacting with scientists and this idea of default atheism, how would you, or what sort of questions would you ask an atheist, someone who identifies as an atheist? What would you ask them to determine whether they are resulting to default atheism?
Well, I'd ask a question like, do you think science can be used as a tool to test different worldview perspectives? I mean, it seems to me you believe that science is a powerful tool to rule out young earth creationism. Could it actually be used to evaluate other bad belief systems? And what about this idea of atheism? I mean, is there any scientific evidence to support an atheistic worldview that gets them thinking? So questions like that.
Yeah. And, you know, I think it's important to, like you're saying, to ask these questions about kind of what their perspective leads them to when they think about these big questions of life. And then also to show kind of science's role in their worldview, and also its role in your worldview. Because again, when we go back to those misperceptions, they might think, hey, you know, this guy doesn't really respect science. So if you start on that common ground of respecting science, it's a good way to kind of unpack what their worldview is, and then see if there's maybe a little bit more common ground. So when we think about science and your mutual love of science with these fellow scientists, a common comment is that science isn't supposed to answer the why questions. It'll tell you how, but it won't tell you why. So how does that fit with the human experience and the big questions that we ask?
Well, I'll bring up questions like, do you think that the universe is fine-tuned to make life possible? Virtually every scientist I've engaged has said, yes, it does. Well, why? And why is the fine-tuning more dramatic for humans than it is for bacteria? Does that indicate or suggest that there might be purpose behind the universe being the way it is? And do you think that science reveals elegance and beauty? And again, most scientists would say yes. And when I follow it up and say, well, why do we see ubiquitous beauty and elegance throughout all the sciences? Or why do you think there's such great consistency amongst all the sciences? So let's get some thinking again. Gee, there's more to science than just the data.
Right. So then what is the next step? Let's say you're having that conversation with a scientist and they're saying, okay, I do recognize that there's fine tuning, and I do recognize that with regard to humanity, we see it at a much greater level than we see it for bacteria. So there's something very special about humans. What would be the next step for them? How would you invite them to continue exploring kind of the design that we see in nature and how that harmonizes with a Christian perspective?
Well, I'd ask them a question. In your ongoing studies of science, do you recognize that there seems to be increasing evidence for this fine-tuning design for human benefit as we learn more and more? And most of them will say yes. And again, well, why is that the case? And they would often ask me a question: what do you think is going on here? And I said, well, as a Christian, I see these texts in the Bible that tell us the more we learn about nature, the more evidence we'll see for the handiwork of God. And this Origin of Life conference, someone was actually talking about what they call the hand of God dilemma. So it was relevant to what they were hearing right there. But also find that I gain a lot of credibility just being fluent with the scientific literature. That's what really opened the door. They assumed that since I was a Christian, I was fairly ignorant about science. I wasn't keeping up. But when they realized that our research scientists actually publish articles on a weekly basis on the latest scientific discoveries, mean, that really opened the door and says, it seems like you're reading the literature more than we do. And that began, and what I noticed was just spending that time with them on the scientific issues, they began to ask Bible and theology questions.
Yeah.
I remember there's one MIT research scientist, very famous. She walked back with us to our dormitories, but for 20 minutes, she was asking Bible questions. And so it's like, okay, if you give a really good scientific defense of your Christian faith, that will often lead people into the biblical and theological issues, and eventually to them considering what Christ offers through his redemptive sacrifice.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that, Hugh. There's a lot to unpack. You certainly are well versed in the literature, and our readers and viewers can see how by going to reasons.org and searching for your blog, Today's New Reason to Believe. And they can also search for default atheism to just get more on this topic. But it's a lot to unpack. So thank you again, Hugh, for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Hello, Jeff Zwerink, and welcome back to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas to help you be more convinced of the truth of Christianity. Today, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Fazale Rana, and we are going to be asking the question, did a computer algorithm solve the origin of life problem? Fuzz, it's good to have you here today.
Jeff, thanks for having me.
Looking forward to our conversation. So why don't just kind of get us started, kind of lay out for us, what is the origin of life problem and what is it that people are trying to do here?
Yeah, well, from my perspective, one of the most enduring scientific mysteries is the origin of life question. How did life first come to appear here on Earth? And most people in the scientific community approach this from an evolutionary perspective, where they try to essentially understand how molecules that would be present on the early Earth could in effect evolve to generate the very first protocells, with the idea that simple gaseous molecules present in the atmosphere or at hydrothermal vents would react to form more complex molecules that would then begin to aggregate and self-organize into the first protocells that could continue to evolve to give rise to the first cells. And sadly, origin of life researchers can't time travel and go back in time and observe what happened on the early Earth. So their recourse is to go in the lab and to try to recapitulate the different steps that they think could have contributed to chemical evolution and to the origin of life process. And so they try to identify, again, chemical routes that could generate life's building blocks and then have those building blocks combine and organize into more complex structures. So it's called prebiotic chemistry, and that's largely the focus of origin of life research.
So it seems like you've got this problem of taking very relatively primitive chemicals on the early Earth and making them into complex biochemical systems is what life is. That's basically what you're talking about here, correct?
That's exactly right, yes.
Okay, so how does a computer algorithm weigh in on that? Because it seems like that's mainly lab work, if you will.
Yeah, well, the problem is that when you're doing work in the lab, you want it to be relevant to the conditions of the early Earth. You want it to reflect the types of resources that would be present, the types of energy sources. But one of the factors of the early Earth that is very difficult to replicate in the lab is the sheer chemical and physical complexity of the early Earth's environment. And so because of that, most researchers simply focus on singular reactions involving a limited number of reactants. And this allows them to identify the different chemical reactions that could have taken place on the early Earth and figure out the mechanism, but it doesn't really, again, replicate the complexity. And so what you really would like to do ideally is have a vat and throw all kinds of chemicals into that vat that you think would have been present on the early Earth and let it react and see what happens. But until recently, we didn't have the ability to truly analyze that kind of an experiment. And now that we do have that ability, it's still impossible to tease out the different individual chemical processes. So in a sense, you're at this stalemate as to how do you best approach studying chemical evolution.
And so presumably what they've gone is they've been able to take and allow the computer to go search those chemical interactions and things that would just be too complex, too time consuming, or too resource intensive to do in the lab?
That's exactly right. So there's a whole push in organic chemistry to do what's called computer-assisted organic synthesis, where you essentially have enough of an understanding of how chemistry works that you could develop algorithms that could essentially predict how a chemical reaction is going to transpire. And so what this research team did from the Polish National Academy of Sciences is developed an algorithm called alchemy, where they could essentially model the chemical processes happening under the conditions of the early Earth. And so they developed a set of chemical rules that reflected the chemistry of different functional groups and the conditions of the early Earth. And then they just chose a set of molecules they thought would be reasonably present on the early Earth and let them react. And then once they reacted, they took those products that were produced and combined them with their original materials and let them react again. And they did this for 7 generations or for 7 iterations as a way to try to understand the early stages of chemical evolution.
So tell us some of the things they found. I mean, that sounds pretty fascinating that we can, in some sense, replicate conditions that are no longer accessible on the planet in computers and get insight. What did they find when they did this?
Well, they were able to generate like 37,000 different compounds through 7 iterations, which is mind-boggling. But this again shows you the types of chemical complexity that would be present on the early Earth. And they were able to identify chemical reactions that we've already discovered in prebiotic studies in the lab, which is reassuring. And they even discovered new chemical processes that nobody even thought would exist. And they went in the lab and they verified that those chemical processes would actually produce the types of compounds that their model predicted. But then on top of that, they discovered that of those 37 compounds, only 80 of them were biotic, were of biological significance. 40 of them were peptides, which are molecules made by joining amino acids together. And of those 40 compounds that were remaining, they had a set of properties that distinguished them from all the other 37,000 properties. They were thermodynamically stable. They had a limited number of what are called functional groups. Those functional groups that they did have were generally unreactive. And of the functional groups that were present in the molecule, they displayed a balance in terms of their hydrogen bonding properties. And so these are actually these very types of features that would make those molecules persist under the conditions of the early Earth. But those are also, interestingly enough, the very properties that would make those molecules so useful in a biochemical system, so useful for the cell.
So it sounds like they've really discovered and developed a really cool algorithm, some neat computer processes, found some really fascinating stuff. So in terms of the origin of life issue, does this weigh in a creation, or weigh in favor of creation, or does it weigh in favor of evolution?
Well, I mean, the thing to keep in mind is that this is still a computer model, and I believe that it is a rather sophisticated model that performs reasonably well. But all they did was really model the first steps. They still didn't account for how you would go from these building block materials to more complex biomolecules, or how self-organization would take place. So they're a long way off from solving the origin of life problem. There's also, in my mind, some concerns about, is this truly relevant to the conditions of the early Earth? I won't get into those details. So in some respect, I don't know that they necessarily really explained how chemical evolution could produce the origin of life. But on the other hand, they did find some interesting things that I think strongly suggests a theistic interpretation for the origin of life, regardless of whether you think it's creation or evolution.
So kind of briefly, if you will, what are some of those things that weigh in favor of a design or theistic background for life?
Yeah, well, let's just say for the sake of argument, you assumed that evolution was the way that life emerged, that it was through chemical evolution. What's interesting is that these researchers seemingly discovered that the laws of nature are constructed in such a way that chemical reactions that would have happened on the early Earth are going to produce compounds that would persist, but that also would be biologically useful in a cellular system. So it's almost like the laws of nature have prescribed certain chemical processes that inevitably are leading you to the types of materials you would need for the origin of life. And so to me, this is kind of like an anthropic coincidence, if you will, that suggests that even if you're thinking about the origin of life from an evolutionary perspective, it looks as if things have been jimmy-rigged in such a way to make life possible. And if it's jimmy-rigged in that way, then it suggests that there's a mind behind everything. So whether you approach the origin of life from a creation model perspective or from an evolutionary perspective, you seem to be forced into the same place, that there needs to be a mind that's involved in this process.
Well, thank you very much, Fuzz. I appreciate your comments. You know, when we do look at the origin of life, it is a fascinating, complex, and challenging problem. And it may forever remain, at least in its entirety, outside a scientific understanding. But what I find fascinating about this discovery, as Fuzz highlights, is that as we continue to advance in our understanding of this difficult and complex topic, we still find evidence that points to a mind. You know, I'd encourage you to go to reasons.org and check out Fuzz's blog on this. Have researchers developed a computer algorithm that explains the origin of life? You'll get some great resources that equip you to share the fascinating discoveries we've made about this universe and how they point to a creator who's created us to know him.
That does it for us this week on 2019. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that it helped equip you to share your faith with confidence and compassion.
And don't forget, subscribe to the show and also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at 2819 Show. We'd love to hear, do you think we are in a computer algorithm?
And if you're watching the show on YouTube and maybe you want to take a break from the screen and get the audio version, you can get us on most major podcast services. Just search Reasons to Believe podcast.
See you next week.